On a warm summer night, a group of college students are partying hard, music blasting and drinks flowing. In one of the rooms, we meet Chance, who's clearly high on drugs. He's lounging on a couch, watching two girls kiss. Too out of it to notice when brothers Brad and Brett walk in. Chance lazily offers them drugs and invites them to join him. Brett agrees, but Brad declines, saying he's done with the party and needs to leave. Before leaving, Brad reminds Brett not to drive under the influence and mentions Leah, a girl he invited, who's upset he's still at the party. Brad heads out to the parking lot, where a stranger approaches him, asking for a ride. Brad hesitates but eventually agrees. The boy runs back to fetch a friend, and though Brad feels uneasy, he lets them both into his car. As they drive, the strangers keep delaying giving Brad directions. Suspicious, Brad tries to stay calm, but the tense vibe in the car makes him nervous. After 30 minutes, Brad loses patience and demands to know what's going on. One of the strangers orders him to pull over, takes his keys, and grabs him. They force him out of the car, demand his ATM card and PIN, and despite his compliance, beat him brutally. After stealing his belongings, they leave Brad injured on the roadside. Bruised and barely conscious, Brad somehow makes it home. He stands outside, but Brett, still partying, doesn't notice him. The next morning, Brett visits Brad and confesses he spent the night driving around with a knife, searching for the attackers but found nothing. Feeling guilty, Brett promises revenge, but Brad dismisses the idea, saying it's pointless. The brothers argue, and Brett leaves. After Brett goes, Brad takes photos of his injuries for evidence. When he recovers enough, he reports the attack to the police. However, the investigator accuses him of being involved in drugs, dismissing his story. Angry and frustrated, Brad leaves the station, overwhelmed by guilt and self-blame for not fighting back. Over time, Brad's wounds heal, though the trauma lingers. Now preparing for college, he keeps himself busy with chores and spending time with family. One day, Brett, back from college, invites Brad to a party. Hesitant at first, Brad agrees. At the party, Brad tries to relax but feels uneasy when Chance mocks him about the attack. Later, Brad confides in Leah, admitting he thought of her during the assault and felt he'd let her down. Leah reassures him and they share a kiss. Brett interrupts, lightening the mood with a joke, and the brothers head home. Before going in, Brad asks Brett if he's weak for not fighting back. Brett dodges the question, but Brad insists he'd defend himself if it happened again. The next day, the brothers bond while swimming, and Brad tells Brett he wants to attend the same college. Brett is thrilled and takes Brad to Brookman College, introducing him to his friends and fraternity brothers. At a fraternity party, Brad meets his new roommate Will and tries to fit in. Chance shows off his arrogant side but apologizes after Brad defends Will. As Brad becomes involved with Phi Sigma, the fraternity promises to protect him like family. This gives Brad a sense of belonging and confidence. However, the road to full acceptance is harsh. The pledges, including Brad and Will, face humiliating initiation tasks like chugging alcohol, eating hot sauce, and enduring punishments while being yelled at. One night, when Will fails a task, Chance locks him in a cage and lets others humiliate him further. Brad witnesses the cruelty, but stays silent, unsure of what to do. The next morning, the pledges are woken up by Dixon, who orders them to leave the house. Exhausted from the night before, Brad rests against a tree. Brett finds him but tells him this process is meant to weed out the weak. Brad insists he'll prove he belongs and doesn't need help. Later, in their dorm, Jim suggests they go out for pizza. While eating, Brad shows Jim pictures of his injuries from the summer attack. Jim is speechless, but Brad admits he's tired of feeling weak. The next morning, Brad is woken up by Phi Sigma brothers barging into his dorm and blindfolding him. They drag him to the bathroom, saying he'll have to eat something disgusting. Brett is there, but doesn't intervene. When Chance forces something against Brad's mouth, he resists it until he realizes it's just a banana. The brothers laugh, calling him weak, and leave. Jim, who had been hiding, thanked Brad for not giving away his location. That night, Dixon visits Brett in his dorm and invites him to join the hazing activities. Brett declines, questioning if this year's pledging has become more extreme. Dixon gets defensive and insists it's still easier than what he went through. After Dixon leaves, Brett seems uneasy, showing he no longer finds the hazing fun. Later, the pledges, now called goats, were blindfolded and taken by car to a remote forest by the Phi Sigma brothers. Once there, the blindfolds were removed, and Dixon explained they would play a game. He would ask questions, and anyone who answered wrong had to drink alcohol. Dixon asked several tricky questions, and most of the pledges got them wrong, ending up drinking heavily. When it was Jim's turn, he correctly answered that the American flag has red, white, and blue colors. However, Dixon unfairly declared the answer wrong and told Jim his punishment was to slap Brad. Jim hesitated, but after being insulted and pressured, reluctantly slapped Brad. Brad didn't want to fight back, but was forced to by Dixon. The two ended up slapping each other harder and harder harder under Dixon's orders. Frustrated, Brett stepped in and shouted at Dixon to stop, saying they had done enough. Afterward, the brothers dumped food and drinks on the pledges and pretended to hump them like animals. The pledges felt humiliated but didn't dare complain. Next, Chance brought in a live goat and gave shocking orders. He told the pledges that one of them would have to engage in inappropriate acts with the goat, after which the group would kill it and eat it. The brothers cheered while the pledges were terrified. They were ordered to strip and wash off the dirt on their bodies, followed by drinking more alcohol to get intoxicated. The pledges were then blindfolded again. The brothers pretended to make the pledges perform inappropriate acts with balloons, pretending they were parts of their bodies. When it was Brad's turn, Brett couldn't stand it and left the scene. Later, the pledges were made to crawl into a goat barn, where they would sleep for the night. They were treated like animals, covered in mud by the brothers, and ordered to wrestle with each other. Afterward, Chance told them they had 3 hours to finish an entire keg of warm beer. If they failed, their punishment would involve the goat. Desperate to avoid punishment, the pledges drank as much as they could but started throwing up from exhaustion. Brad pushed himself and managed to finish the keg. He rang the bell, signaling completion, and the brothers celebrated, especially praising Brad. Despite the praise, it was clear Brad wasn't okay. The next morning, Brad woke up in bed and took a picture of the bruises around his eye from the previous night. The bruises were brutal. Later that day, Dixon gathered the pledges and brothers for a meeting to present them with the fraternity's Bible, their guide to the rules of Phi Sigma. Dixon told them their suffering wasn't over. They still had to spend a semester as the brothers' slaves. Later, at a formal ceremony in a gym, the pledges, wearing their fraternity uniforms, were officially welcomed as members of Phi Sigma. They were given a badge and the fraternity's Bible. Brad felt proud, but noticed Brett wasn't there. Brett had claimed he couldn't attend because of a Spanish exam, but in reality, he was working out at the gym. Feeling betrayed, Brad confronted Brett in his dorm room. He demanded to know why Brett wasn't there and why he thought Brad couldn't handle Dixon. At first, Brett didn't want to answer, but when pushed, he told Brad that none of this mattered in the end. Brad angrily argued it did matter and accused Brett of looking down on him. Brett told Brad he didn't belong in the fraternity and should quit. Hurt, Brad left, determined to prove his brother wrong. The next day, Brad spent time feeding the goat outside while the brothers continued hazing the juniors inside. The pledges were lined up and ordered to jump up and down as the brothers threw fruits and vegetables at them. When Brad walked in, Dixon told him to join the line. Brad refused, but Dixon warned him to leave the house if he wouldn't obey. During the hazing, Chance accidentally hit Jim on the head with an orange, causing him to collapse in pain. Brad tried to defend Jim, but Jim quickly stood up and acted fine to avoid further punishment. The next day, Brad went to the library and received a call from his hometown police station. They had identified suspects from his summer assault and asked him to come in to confirm. Brad declined, saying he couldn't go back to that. Later, he told Brett about the call. Brett insisted they should confront the attackers together, but Brad refused, saying he had moved on. This led Brett to blame himself for the attack, saying it was the reason Brad became obsessed with proving he wasn't weak. Brad angrily told Brett it wasn't his decision to make and stormed off. At the dorms, Chance and another brother went to Jim's room, distracting him while wrapping him in duct tape. They left him tied up and unable to free himself. Exhausted, Jim later went to the stadium to work out. While running, he suddenly collapsed from a heart attack, falling unconscious. The next day, Brad was in his dorm, packing up Will's belongings while crying quietly. He felt deep sadness and guilt over his friend's death, but didn't know how to fix it. Brett came to comfort him, but nothing could make Brad feel better after what had happened. A memorial for Will was held at the school, attended by his friends and the Phi Sigma brothers. Outside the ceremony, Chance approached Brad, gave him a hug, and apologized for their loss. He invited Brad to a meeting at the fraternity house later that night, saying it would be a time for the brothers to talk and relax, without drinking. Brad felt uneasy and said he couldn't come, but Chance insisted, saying brothers should stick together. Brad reluctantly agreed just to end the conversation. That afternoon, the brothers gathered at the fraternity house with Dixon. He told them the school had placed Phi Sigma on probation and started an investigation. Dixon explained they would all have to meet with the provost. This news stressed Chance, who worried his father would find out, and another brother, who feared losing his scholarship if the school learned about Jim's head injury. Dixon stayed calm and advised them to answer difficult questions with, "I don't know." The group also felt angry that Brad hadn't shown up for the meeting. Meanwhile, Brad was in the dean's office, being questioned about the pledging process. When asked if anything unusual had happened, Brad described it as basic stuff. The dean then brought up Jim's head injury and asked why he had been in the infirmary just a week before his death. Brad avoided the question, saying it didn't matter anymore because nothing could bring Jim back. Later, Brad was walking through campus when a junior approached him, rushing to tell him the fraternity had been suspended for the rest of the year. Someone had revealed all the hazing activities to the school. Confused and unsure who could have spoken out, Brad returned to his dorm, only to find it trashed with goat manure, and the goat itself was there too. The fraternity had done this as revenge, assuming Brad was the one who exposed them. Inside the room, Brad found a box of laxatives they had given to the goat. Frustrated, he dragged the goat to the fraternity house to prove his loyalty. When he arrived, Chance didn't let him speak and accused him of being a snitch. He angrily confronted Brad, asking how he dared to show his face after betraying them. Brad denied the accusations, but Chance spat in his face, slapped him, and tried to provoke him into fighting. Brad didn't react. At that moment, Brett came downstairs and revealed he was the one who had spoken to the school. He explained that, unlike the others, he understood that none of the fraternity's hazing traditions truly mattered. Furious, Chance tried to attack Brett, but Brett quickly overpowered him. Brett punched Chance several times, leaving him bleeding. Afterward, Brett and Brad left the fraternity house together and drove straight to their hometown. The next day, they went swimming in the sea, just like they used to in the past. Later, they went to the police station so Brad could try to identify his attackers from the summer. At the station, Brad was shown a lineup of suspects. He learned that one of the attackers had been killed after being released on bail for robbing a gas station. Brad looked at the remaining suspects, but wasn't sure if any of them were involved. Sitting in the car afterward, Brad teared up. When Brett asked if he let the attacker go, Brad admitted he couldn't be sure. He began to cry, and Brett comforted him, reminding him that none of it was his fault. To help Brad finally heal, Brett drove him to the place where the assault had happened. Brad stood there for a moment, breathing deeply as he let go of the pain and fear he had carried for so long. For the first time, he felt a sense of relief and closure. This movie is based on true events and was a real story of the Brad Land's experiences transferring to Clemson University after being brutally beaten and assaulted, pledging with his golden boy brother to Kappa Sigma.